For example, the Native American rituals of vision quest, where the 12-year-old, for example, not necessarily, would be in a hut, like a little lodge, you might call it, and just be by themselves for 10 days, taken food and water by their parents.
Keep watching to learn more. You can now download all 9 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org. New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Book 4 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring initiation from an anthropological and historical perspective. My guest, Andy Hilton, is the author of Anthropology and Mysticism in the Making of Initiation. He's also edited an anthology called Perspectives on Commoning. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you, thank you.
You have endeavored in your book to actually, I would have to say, establish a new field of study. You call it initiation studies.
Which is a logical name for the studies of initiation, yes. Historically, there have been many studies of initiation in anthropology, for example, but no name of this as a discipline or a sub-discipline, so I give it that name.
Yeah.
And extend it with my vision of what initiation might be to include disciplines that are not normally included under that rubric.
Mm-hmm. Well, it might be useful to mention right at the outset that you were inspired to engage in this project. I think it took you some 30 years to write your book because you went through what we'd have to call an initiatory experience yourself.
About 2/3 of the way through it, specifically a 9-month period. There was a workshop given by Robert Bly on male initiation, and at the start of that workshop, he said there are 3 kinds of initiation: male, female, and spiritual. And as he said that, the penny dropped. So that's what's happening. I'm going through a spiritual initiation. So that gave me the name for the experience I was going through and established my interest over a few years, yeah.
And it's also fair to say that in your case, it was a life-changing experience.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And it really led you to begin a decades-long study of what the concept of initiation really means.
Indeed, yeah. Yeah. Starting from that point of Robert Bly with male initiation, critiquing that from a gender perspective, going back to the anthropology and the roots that he was picking from, critiquing that, noting the shamanic initiation aspect and how that came through in the spiritual traditions and theosophy and such like, and wondering where all this fitted, how we got from the tribal to the theosophic. It didn't really, so I was trying to figure out how this all came together. So that took me into the history of it, into the roots, to try and get some sense of the whole thing, where we'd come to, and also where we could be, because the general assumption in anthropology is that there is no initiation anymore. So I wanted to kind of try and rework that idea a little bit.
Well, I gather an important notion that anthropologists have come up with is the idea of a rite of passage, a transition from one stage of life to another.
In anthropology, there have been three major contributions, I would say, in the 20th century. One was the idea of rites of passage from Arnold van Gennep, Le Rite de Passage, just a direct translation into the English. And that became like an item of contemporary popular culture. Death and Rebirth is another one. And the third, from Victor Turner, picking on the central part of the tripartite of Van Gennep's separation, liminality, incorporation or reincorporation series, the central part being the liminal, and that's Victor Turner's focus on liminality or marginality. So we have liminality as another contribution of initiation studies to contemporary culture.
Well, I know you don't write about the bar mitzvah, but as growing up Jewish, the bar mitzvah is a major event in most Jewish boys. A bat mitzvah for Jewish girls these days. I don't know that was always the case, but it was a very clear demarcation between being a child and being recognized in your religious community as an adult.
Right.
And in my case, I, grew up in a Midwestern town, very conventional, conservative, community, but the bar mitzvah was a huge event.
Right.
Prepared for it for over a year.
And afterwards, would you have been considered adult?
For ritual purposes.
Right, okay.
I tried to tell my parents, I'm an adult now, I can decide when I go to bed. No way, that didn't work. Culturally, I was not an adult, but I was entitled at that point to participate in the Jewish rituals as any other adult.
Right, and from my perspective, that would be better conceived as a separation ritual, initiating your entry into the liminal phase, which is youth, which starts at, for example, age 12 and continues an indefinite period, but certainly through adolescence, maybe through the 20s, maybe through the 30s even, until a period of settlement, which is a more contemporary notion of adulthood, whatever that may be exactly.
Well, one thing I noticed in reviewing your book is that amongst, for example, I think it was the Australian Aborigines, their initiation rituals were pretty rough. I mean, they knocked out some teeth.
Yeah, that was one of the early glyphs of initiation, knocking out the teeth. That was noticed by the British explorers in the 1700s. 1690 even, I think, was the first expeditionary journal recording of native peoples, whatever the phrase was for the native peoples, with one or two teeth knocked out. And that continued, and Robert Bly is still noting that. That continued through the history, that noting of the knocking out of teeth, But the scarification, I think, was much more painful procedure. But all these tribal, as they're called, tribal rituals of initiation involved pain, I think, but not necessarily. For example, the Native American rituals of vision quest, where the 12-year-old, for example, not necessarily, would be in a hut, like a little lodge, you might call it, and just be by themselves for 10 days, taken food and water by their parents. So that wouldn't necessarily be painful in a physical sense.
But it involved isolation.
It involved isolation, It'd be quite a lot of psychological pain, I should imagine.
Now, I know, just had a friend return from a visit to South America, where in Colombia, the Kogi people live high up in the mountains in very inaccessible areas, and they take the certain people who are initiated into their shamanistic tradition, and they keep them in a cave, and they live in that cave by themselves for sometimes 10 years.
Okay.
Very intense.
Yeah, that would be intense. And the cave as a motif of initiation is found in the Greek period, for example. The Plato's cave, we've gone back there with the cave idea. Any kind of covering, insulation, entrapment will work for this. The alternative is not going inward out of society, but going physically outward of society. So going outside the village territory. So you're going into the wild. So there's kind of two ways of going out
into
of
the cave
normal.
or out into the woods on a vision quest.
Yeah, so either way, they're rather different, but either way you're going out of social life. And the normal patterns of existence, of relating to people. Maybe, so in the classic male sense, or masculine toned initiation, it would be out and with group, so it'd be a much more group affair. And the internal one would have a feminine toned initiatory sense. In your cave one, that's a little bit different again. You mentioned shamanism, so that's more like, I kind of relate the spiritual and the feminine toning as a little bit connected in that sense. They're more interior than exterior.
Well, one of the things I gather the early anthropologists noted as they began studying various indigenous peoples is that their initiation rituals were often quite complex. They had stages of initiation, and the early anthropologists were struck by how the Aboriginal people seemed to have a process very much reminiscent of the ancient Greeks.
Yes, but also they would relate it to the Freemasons, and they gave the name initiation in Australia in the 1840s, and that would have been related to the Masonic naming of that ritual as initiation, because previously the Masons had called it admission, and they moved from admission to initiation. So far as I can see, a little bit before anthropology did, but there's a complex interweaving of influences there.
But it suggests now if we see initiation rituals amongst indigenous people who were not regarded as civilized, although one might question that judgment these days. But in any case, there seems to be some kind of a continuity, maybe going back to ancient Egypt through the Greeks and into the Masonic and Rosicrucian traditions right up to modern times.
Yeah. And in my book, I call it the making of initiation. So, yeah, we make that continuity. Partly through the vocabulary, using the word initiation and throwing that back to the ancient mysteries, where the word initiation wasn't quite used in the same way, it wasn't used at all necessarily. And a lot of translations of texts from the Greek, where of course there was no word initiation, have brought initiation into those original texts where it wasn't there. So we've made that lineage.
So you're suggesting that could be a projection of the modern mind back historically.
Yes and no. Yes and no.
Well, yes and no seems to come up all the time in your work because there's so many different threads.
Right. Yes and no. A projection, of course, a construction, but then any reality is a construction. So does that make it any different from anything else? In some ways, definitely a projection, but in other ways, no. The common thread is there to be seen.
Yeah.
So then we get into deeper notions of how we resonate the subjective with the objective to come at a sense of reality, such as there has been initiation through the ages, from times in the Paleolithic caves until now. When I was coming here, chatting to the person next to me, he said, previously, I told him what I was doing. He said previously on his flight on the pilot, the young pilots had crossed the international date line for the first time on KLM, so they dressed him up in women's clothes, makeup, put him and took him round the plane. So that's still going on, these little ceremonies of initiation, even now. I don't know if those people would have considered that an initiation, but probably they could have used that word in Dutch. This was KLM, but they might have used the word initiation, yeah.
Yeah, I might just mention, for benefit of our viewers, you flew to Albuquerque from Istanbul.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, especially to be here. Yeah.
For which I'm very grateful.
Well, me too. Thanks.
And it does seem that there are many, many different kinds of initiation. On the one hand, to demarcate the difference between being a child and an adult. Yep. On the other hand, the making of a shaman or a high priest.
Yeah, so if we go back to where I started with Robert Blythe, he split male, female, and spiritual. Spiritual just being a word, you might say mystical or some other word, of course. And male and female are the binary for adult. Mm-hmm. So we got the split between spiritual and adult, and then we got the split adult, male, female, which is also critiqued, at least by me, not conventionally, but I critique this splitting of male and female. I find it a little bit rigid, a little bit exclusive, and there's been certainly work in initiation looking at third sex, third gender subjects, which is problematizing this binary there. But overall, that's the adult side of it, and there's the spiritual side of it. And so there's these kind of two main threads of or levels of initiation of work. And that goes back from the original mysteries into shamanism, through anthropology. Yeah, these two threads are...
But it seems in a way it starts with shamanism and maybe in your case even ends with shamanism. You mentioned a moment ago the Paleolithic caves. Some of these caves go back 15,000 years, maybe 30,000 years. And it seems as if there's some consensus in the anthropological community. They were used for ritual purposes, for purposes of initiation.
Yeah, that may have been the case, although it's highly subjective. It's a very hypothetical notion, and that seems to me to be projection, and it's entirely likely it's a good projection, but the evidence is really pretty scant. It's coming back from what we know about the present, projecting it onto the past. And there isn't really a lot of evidence that I know of. I mean, there's, a few markings in caves and a bit of ochre and such like. And from that, they build up a picture. There's maybe one cave here and one cave here. And there's a little rock tunnel they're climbing through. So they're coming up with that. So they're projecting the idea of initiation back onto this rather limited archaeological evidence. And it may well be a good projection.
Yeah. Well, the idea that you have to crawl through a little tunnel into a cave opening where if you are fortunate enough to have some kind of fire or light available, you can see drawings on the cave wall. It's almost like a return to the womb.
Well, that's a very nice way of putting it. So being born is an initiation, and we can also put this as a patterning onto many levels of experience. Being born is an initiation. Living is an initiation into death. Spirituality was an initiation from religion into wherever we're going into in the new age, the space age, whatever we call what's happening now. Yeah, indeed that.
But I can imagine if you're alone in a cave, you're going to enter into an altered state of consciousness.
I could imagine that.
Certainly sooner or later.
Yeah, quite likely. I don't suppose everybody would. We'd need to be careful about overgeneralizing, but there would you would assume that would be a tendency. It's a technique to develop, to produce.
And it does seem to me to be the case that an altered state of consciousness is involved in many of the other initiation rituals, not just those encountered by anthropologists, but also our historical understanding of the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Greeks, other ancient peoples. And in your experience, in contemporary shamanic workshops, you also entered into an altered state of consciousness.
Yes, and I would personally regard that as the quintessential initiation, which is into what is currently called cosmic consciousness, or unitive consciousness, or God is another name for that experience, which is like the greater mystery or the mystery. In Christian terms, it's the mystery which is the mystery of God. In Platonic terms, it's the mystery again. That's a quintessential experience, I think, of initiation.
Now, you mentioned the Christian mysteries, and it appears from the historical record that the Greek mystery tradition sort of died out in the Christian era, but it seems in early Christianity they also incorporated something akin to the Greek mysteries.
Something like that, yeah. It seems to be a complex history, as best I could figure it out. The Greek or Roman, by this time, I suppose, mystery tradition didn't exactly die out. It was more died out by the take up of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Indeed, yeah. And the relationship between Christianity and initiation is interesting and complex. The sacraments can be related directly to initiatory practices. There are contrary views in that respect. The life of Christ, Jesus, the figure Christ, is also an initiatory story and has been reviewed that way for 100 years, yeah.
Well, let's focus for a moment on the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece. I think one of the most remarkable aspects of these mysteries, what little we know about them, is that almost all the prominent people of the society went through the ritual.
Yeah. They seem to be pretty big.
It wasn't limited just to the priestly class or the shamanic class.
Right. I don't know much about the extent of the democratic extent of it, but there were major rites for a long period of time. And
also there was a secrecy about it. So while we know that many prominent people of the culture went through this ritual, and I think we also know that pretty much they came out of it having lost any fear of death.
That is said. Yeah. That is said, it may be true. The element of secrecy is important. What went on is not well known because it was not allowed to be spoken of. Well, one would expect it to have been spoken of, and yet there is precious little, almost no record of exactly what happened. So it really is a mystery. So that's kind of, the name mystery really does encapsulate the idea of the greater mystery, which can be the cosmological
and the idea that this tradition lasted for centuries. in ancient Greece. You'd think over that period of time it'd be almost impossible for a secret to be kept so well.
If it was any kind of ordinary secret, yes, but if the secret was an experience, you cannot really transfer an experience in words. It can only resonate with somebody who has had one. It's still incredible. I think it's still incredible that there seems to be no record. It may be that we just haven't found the records. It may be that there are records that we haven't located. That's possible.
It is said that the mystical experience is ineffable. You can't speak of it. And yet poets write about it. Mystics write about it. It may not be possible to speak of it precisely, but people endeavor to put it into words. And there were many poets and playwrights in ancient Greece who went through that process.
Yeah, you use the word ineffable. Of course, that's coming from William James. I take issue with that myself. I find it not necessarily to be ineffable in any sense that any other experience is ineffable. For example, can you talk to me? Can you explain to me your experience of, and in consciousness studies, the classic example is blue. Yeah. So what is it like to experience blue? And you can't say what it's like to experience blue exactly. And it's not necessarily so different. It may be different in extent, but it's not necessarily radically different to talk about the experience of whatever we're going to call this thing, source, cosmic consciousness, God, whatever the word is, whatever the expression is. That's on one side of the response to that question. The other side is that it's quite possible to put it into words. And we don't have to be poetic. We can say precisely, not precisely a little bit sharp, but one can say what it is. One can say what the experience consists, the structure of it, the nature of it. We can do that, yeah. So we don't have to be mysticizing about the mystical experience. That's not necessary.
In fact, there are libraries full of books describing it.
Right. In poetic language or fairly straightforward language?
Both. In both instances, philosophical or poetic or dramatic.
Okay, then we need to drop the word ineffable.
Perhaps, although it's hard to pinpoint it precisely. There's a point at which language fails.
And that point holds for any experience, not just a mystical experience.
Isn't that interesting?
That's an argument.
See, what it says to me, actually, is that every experience is a mystical experience.
Oh, that's very nice. I like that, yeah.
It does say that to me, and I regard it that way.
And then we take that further, and then an experience is an item or a moment or an event of consciousness. So consciousness itself is a mystery.
Or a miracle.
Or a miracle, yeah.
The very idea that we're here, it may seem the most prosaic thing in the world. We're sitting in a studio with video cameras in front of us, but think of all that's required for this moment to exist.
I can't imagine that. But it's a miracle, strangely from a scientific point of view, because science has not produced consciousness out of this neuronal matter, this stuff, and one suspects cannot do that. It cannot be reduced. It has to be a fundamental. So that production is somewhat miraculous. The production of consciousness is miraculous because we don't know how to do that. Maybe we'll get a better explanation, but there's not a lot of hope.
Well, my friend Jack Sarfati, who I've spoken about in one of the In Presence monologues I've done, believes that he knows how, if he only had another $100 million in government funding, we could build conscious robots.
Okay.
In his opinion. And who knows? I'd say it's a long shot, but maybe he's right. Like Data in Star Trek.
Well, what would they be built of?
Matter.
Yeah. So is the matter conscious?
Well, it's, what are we built of?
Yeah, exactly. We're going down another line here, I think. Yeah.
In any case, we're drifting a bit away from our central focus here.
Indeed,
on initiation. What do we know about the early Christian mysteries? I'm under the impression that they didn't last that long, that there was a lot of criticism, like, you're behaving as if you were Greeks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was that. There certainly was a mysteries tradition, mysteries programs set up by the early Christian fathers. Among the most famous of early Christians, they advocated and planned mysteries, mystagogic performances. There was that, and I'm not sure how long that lasted. I think it faded, but I can't really say when from my memory. And it may not have been the same in all places, because Christianity wasn't one thing. There were many Christianities, so it would be different in different places, different centers. What was going on in Rome might have been quite different from what was going on in Trieste, for example.
Well, I gather that an important part of it were the desert fathers, who basically, like the shamans, were living alone in the desert, often in caves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was another influence, and from that we came through to the monastic system. That was a direct source into the monastic system, and that in itself is an initiatory framework. And that did continue, of course. That didn't die out, no matter to what extent Christianity suppressed, reduced, disallowed active experience in an initiatory framework, so that only one was taking a piece of bread representing the body, etc. There was nothing really going on ish. It could be, of course, but it's not very active. Well, you're
referring to the Eucharist.
Yeah, in this case.
Ceremony, which is if looked at carefully, it's a mystical event of some sort, incorporating the body of Christ within oneself.
It's a mystical representation, but whether the individual has a mystical experience is questionable. But at the same time, the monastic system was continuing. So although the initiatory history was being pushed down, as you could put it, by the Christian development and the hegemonious development of what people should believe and the dogma and what they should do, etc., etc. At the same time, there was the monastic tradition, which upheld to a certain extent, in some ways, the initiatory framework, and that eventually led to the Jesuits, who did employ an initiatory system for their youngsters, and it included readings, and it led eventually to the application of the idea of the old mysteries to the tribal situation in Canada in 1710, 1720 by, what was his name? Joseph Francois Lafitau. And that would be one of the pinpoints for the connection from the mysteries to the tribal initiation.
Because we're talking about someone who is both a Jesuit priest and, in effect, an anthropologist.
Yeah, his work is sometimes called proto-anthropology, like the first work in proto-anthropology. And it's very highly regarded in some aspects, like his design work, his study of the designs of the dwellings, for example. He does very nice drawings, and he's got a lot of nice observations, but he's centrally concerned with it's in 2 volumes, but the heart of the book is very much concerned with the initiation. He doesn't use the word initiation at that point. This is too early for the application. At that point, it's still the mysteries, and he's primarily concerned, the very heart of it is with the spiritual aspect, what we would call now the shamanic.
And he's in North America.
That's right. This is
French territories of Canada.
Yeah, Iroquois Seneca people in the French Canada area. Yeah.
And am I correct in suggesting that he noticed some connection between their rituals and those of the ancient Greeks?
The ancient Greeks, those as reported by the early Christian fathers and mothers. I don't think he mentions the mothers, but that's something that should be mentioned. There were the early Christian mothers also. He puts those two. He puts those two, and he makes the connection. He's not the first to make the connection. That was done like at least 100 years before that in South America. That connection of the activities of the savages or the savage in their production of what we would call the shaman. That's generalizing that word across all cultures. They would have different words according to each culture. I use the word spirit worker, like sex worker. We have spirit worker. That's what I prefer. That they might not like to be called shaman because that's a projection of the Western taking of a very specific cultural item
from Siberia,
exactly, and then imposing it on not on everybody, not really on. You don't talk so much about African shamanism or Australian shamanism. That's less common, but certainly in the Americas, that's generally applied. Yeah. But going back to the origin of this application of the Greco-Roman history onto the experience of the peoples in the New World. So we have the explorers discovering the New World in the 16th century, in the 1500s, seeing the people there, and this is all very new. This is other, this is foreign, and they are relating it to that other foreignness, which is their root in the Greco-Roman culture, and they're making a connection between the two, and that also develops in the realm of initiation.
I suspect some of it may be that these Jesuit priests and others who were the early investigators were very sympathetic to the natives and didn't want to see them just as savages, but by relating them to the ancient Greeks and Romans who were held in high esteem, it was a way of bestowing on them a certain status, perhaps.
Yeah. There's more than one way of looking at that. One way is that they regarded them as humans. They could be saved. They were worth working for in the missionary context. So therefore they were not savage in the sense of animal, in the sense of capital to be used for labor and conquest. So in that sense they would be sympathetic. Of course, they wouldn't be sympathetic to their particular expression of their spirituality in terms of the savage, satanic form. They would also call them satanic. Mm. So it was a two-edged knife, that one.
As in practically everything you've encountered.
Yeah, of course. And yes and no.
So we also touched on the Freemasons and their rituals. And I think the Freemasons is another organization where in some sense it's like a trade guild, and in another sense it's carrying on a perennial philosophy going back perhaps to the ancient Egyptians.
Yes and no. Indeed. Contemporary scholarship focuses on the 18th century as the birth of modern Freemasonry, or the rebirth of Freemasonry, we could say, of Masonry. And it's quite linked to not so much the secrecy and clandestine aspects that we think of now popularly, but more to the Enlightenment and to a scientific thrust.
Rationalism.
Indeed, yeah. But at the same time, this esoteric thread carrying through, and the rites of admission into the order.
Well, it raises for me, I think, a very interesting point, and that is that we often associate rationalism with the science, and of course, rationalism in the 18th century and the 17th century involved revolutionary fervor to overthrow the rule of monarchs. And so the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians are often linked to revolutionary movements. Some people assume that if you're interested in the mystical, the occult, the esoteric, that you're forsaking rationalism in favor of some sort of superstition, irrational superstition of the unconscious. But other people, particularly today, particularly many guests on this video channel, when we talk about the philosophy of idealism, the perennial philosophy and so on, insist that it's through rational logic that they arrive at esoteric truths.
Carry on. Yeah.
Well, I tend to take that view. I think that you can be highly rational, and that leads you to an appreciation of the mystical.
Okay, so this seems to be like an intellectual journey.
For some?
Right. I mean, for myself, it's experiential. My mysticism comes from my experience. I don't think that I'm a particularly irrational person. I find myself to be fairly rational on the whole, but there is a rationality in the mysticism, and that's not that mysticism isn't in itself a irrational domain outside of rationality.
No, it seems to me that to start with pure experience is more or less what Descartes was advocating in his philosophy. I think, therefore I am. I
think therefore I am better expressed as I am conscious. Yeah. Therefore I am.
Yes.
Indeed. Yeah. And I'm conscious is by coming back to the sense of consciousness itself as a mystical phenomenon.
Qualia.
Indeed.
I'm experiencing the color blue.
If
I'm having that experience, that I must exist. And to me, that is the bedrock of rationality.
How do you mean?
It's where it starts. Any rational system has to start from, I exist. How do I know I exist?
Well, maybe. I'm not sure I would agree with that. I think a rational system can start from a material standpoint of, it doesn't really matter whether I exist, that exists. So we have an alternative of an idealist subjective starting point, which goes with consciousness, and an objective materialist starting point, which goes with objects.
Okay, I could take issue with you there, but that would be a different conversation.
Okay.
I'll pass on the opportunity to engage in a philosophical dispute with you right now, because I want to come back to the role of the Freemasons in our understanding of initiation.
In what context are you?
Well, as I recall, at one point, as anthropologists were looking at the Freemason practices, I suppose some of the anthropologists were Freemasons at that time, and looking at native cultures, they began to demystify the idea of initiation. It became more of a secular thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure if many anthropologists actually were Freemasons. Masonry in the 19th century in Britain wasn't necessarily that well respected, is my sense of things, even though, of course, it went all the way up to the crown. It was always a slightly alternative thread. Not so much that the anthropologists themselves were Freemasons, but more that they understood the ritual activities that they observed among the tribal peoples in terms of the practices as they understood or conceived the contemporary culture of the time being Masonic. That's how they related it. It would be the native activities in this ritual that makes a boy into a man, paradigmatically, are like the activities in the Masonic temple. Whether they'd actually been in a Masonic temple is another matter. Maybe they had, maybe they hadn't. Usually they hadn't, I think. Once or twice they had. Once or twice they were, or they'd been involved in the Masonic ritual of entry, but they'd found it to be not worth bothering to carry on. That's also to be found. So this is fair. But I don't think that the anthropologists were Freemasons as such. I don't think that's the influence is not quite so direct. It's a little bit more indirect. It's a general cultural knowledge of something to pin on, something to relate, some way to understand what these strange people are doing.
Well, you mentioned that the crown, the royalty, or the nobility were involved in Freemasonry.
Mm-hmm. As I understand, yeah. I can't remember. One of the, when was this, 1713, and there were two organisations in dispute in Britain. I'm coming back to Britain, of course, there's a whole American tradition there, but just in Britain in 1713, I think that's the right date. Or was it 1813? They were brought together. There was a unification, 1813, there was a unification of the two branches that had separated, and that was under the authority of the fourth Prince Regent. I forget the names, but yeah, it was going very much to the highest levels, yeah.
So, if I understand this correctly, in the Rosicrucian movement of the 17th century, there was an attempt to undermine the monarchical system that was in place in Europe. That the Rosicrucians were to a certain extent revolutionary, but later on it became incorporated by the nobility.
Yeah, it's not something I know much about, but there was always a constant interplay and tensions between the hegemonic religious form and the alternatives, which would play into Catholic Protestant or Protestant Presbyterian Quaker, different aspects of the alternative religious forms in conflict or accepting that was always in play at the same time. Yeah, it's very complex. Any one situation would be different.
Well, do you think there's a sense in which the Masons, in some of their rituals, incorporated anything of an authentic mystical nature?
I can't claim any knowledge on that. A couple of things that I've read were very perfunctory, and you'd get the sense there was nothing much going on at all. But some of the buildings they had would seem to indicate there was a highly elaborate ritual system, and the readings that they had to memorize and the catechisms. Yeah, that would suggest yes. But was that, how mystically, experientially inducing was that? I don't know. I wasn't there. I can't say. I suspect it must have been sometimes. Yeah. It would depend also, like anything like this, on what was being projected, how much the initiate was putting onto this event, this ritual of entry. Was it a big thing for them? If it was this big thing for them, and there was the setting, the established environment was there, then sometimes it would be, I would think. It would be very variable.
I would think so.
Yeah. It's been difficult to generalize.
Well, and ultimately, when we're talking about mystical experience, which is so private, so interior, it's hard to know just by looking at writings or architecture or historical accounts. I think it's fair to say that there were certain individuals, Cagliostro, the Count Saint Germain, who were regarded as mystics, who were also involved in various Masonic orders.
Right, yeah, and that's a fair point. Yeah.
I think Manly Hall, in his book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, does definitely refer to various Masonic traditions as carrying on what he would have regarded, I think, as the perennial philosophy.
Yeah, he would say that, yeah.
We haven't really touched on the ancient Egyptians. And maybe it's a pure projection, but as I visited the pyramids in Giza and other pyramids at Saqqara and elsewhere, they strike me as being more like chambers for initiation with a cave-like quality to them than tombs, for example.
Right. Well, that's another theory. The pyramids, the Egyptian pyramids are fascinating and difficult to know what they're there for. Not just those pyramids in other places in the world. There's many theories. So another theory is it was related to some form of energy production, and then we're getting into a whole other realm of conversation about what was going on in ancient times and our notion of human history and history of more broadly of life on the planet, and that takes it off go in another tangent. Is it possible that the pyramids were used as sounds like a long shot to me? It's interesting, but some of if we're imagining crawling through the long tunnels to get to they're awfully tough climbs. So maybe, it's possible, isn't it?
I'm inclined to think so, based on personal experience.
What was your personal experience?
Now you talked about the sense of cosmic consciousness from the shamanic workshop that you participated in some 3 decades ago. I've been in the King's Chamber, the Great Pyramid, with groups of people on multiple occasions, and my sense was that almost universally, people who had the experience of placing themselves in the sarcophagus in the King's Chamber, the Great Pyramid, often done late at night when there aren't tourists around, because the tourists are chattering and noisy. But often groups were allowed to have a private time. People universally reported experiences, I'd have to call it an altered state of consciousness. Now, you could say the set and the setting were very conducive to that. It may have nothing to do with what the ancient Egyptians experienced, but there was a sense almost universally reported by the individuals I've been with in groups who said it felt like they were flying through space, floating through the cosmos.
And these giant structures were built to house this chamber for this purpose, is the idea.
Perhaps.
It's a huge structure.
Yes.
To build for that.
It would be.
Yeah, that was, and unless we're going to introduce some ideas of the pyramid as a form of a focus of energy which sounds a little bit mystical, but maybe we're talking about a form of energy that isn't recognized. Unless we're talking, that's possible. It sounds, to my mind, it's unlikely that was the purpose of the building of the pyramids, which is not to say that anybody who goes in there won't experience that. Of course, any dark enclosed space, we could experience it here. I mean, if we turn all the cameras off and sit alone, we'll get that.
That's right. It might take just a tiny shift of awareness to have such an experience.
And if you've gone to the pyramids, you're going to be ripe for such a thing.
Absolutely.
And when the crowds go and the chatter goes, it's going to be really, really, really wonderful place for it. And so that one would lead one to wonder, was that actually the intention of the building of the pyramids? And yet these huge structures for that? Well, possible.
They were huge structures, whatever they were for.
Right.
I mean, to say that somebody needed such a huge structure as
for
a tomb.
Anything. Yeah. I mean, I don't take the tomb. The tomb theory is not convincing to me. The initiation theory sounds better. It still doesn't convince me.
You're leaning towards some sort of energy.
Yeah, I am. Yeah. Those sarcophaguses, I mean, they're tremendous things just to lie in those. I think it's something to do with the water, the aquifers. I think there's something different going on with the pyramids, but I have no idea what it may have been. I mean, we could imagine it was how do we produce nuclear fusion? We produce at the moment, or fission? Which one do we produce at the moment? Fission. So we're talking about cold fusion. So could you imagine the pyramids were to house cold fusion? That's going way out, but that's what attracts me, something like that.
I see. Well, we can only speculate.
Yeah. I mean, yours is a much more grounded speculation than mine.
We have a lot to learn yet about cold fusion, and I assume that we will. There are many people who are interested in forms of energy that are not yet recognized generally in the scientific community.
I throw that out there. Equally, we have a lot to learn about ancient architecture. Yeah. I mean, there are very, very rational, level-headed YouTube channels out there looking at the ancient architecture in Peru, in Egypt, in other places, and finding it frankly incredible to think that people at that stage of development could do these works, and giving various reasons and empirical evidence for why it couldn't have been possible.
Well, I think it's fair to say this, Andy, that your book, Anthropology and Mysticism in the Making of Initiation, is an effort to establish initiation studies as a unique field of inquiry.
Yeah,
and it's the first time that, to my knowledge, that's been done.
Yeah, I think that's. I would take that. I would accept that and agree with it. Yeah, that was what I thought I was doing, was establishing initiation studies, not in any way imagining that it would go on to have an effect, but at least doing that.
Yeah. And it would be fair to say that should this field take root, and I hope it does, there'll be a lot of things to explore. One being the architecture of various structures and chambers and caves that may have been used for purposes of initiation.
Well, what your suggesting is quite different from the theory of Paleolithic cave use. Yeah. You're suggesting the high level of design. That's an interesting
or an evolution from one to the other.
More than an evolution, I would say a huge jump.
Well, I want to make another jump before we end this interview, and I should mention, for benefit of our viewers, you're here in Albuquerque, and we plan several more interviews while you're here. But I think it's worth mentioning, just maybe as a little hint of what may yet be to come, that one of the connections that brought you here is through Ray Hernandez's group, FREE, the Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research and Extraordinary Experience, and that you yourself were drawn to that group because you've had some UFO sightings, which, for all we know, may be in some way related to this process of initiation.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to respond to that other than to say that is correct. If I go deeply into it, I think we will be into another 2 or 3 interviews, so I shouldn't say too much. But yes. I guess UFO, I don't like the term UFO for what I experienced. The contemporary term of UAP is much better, because UFO is flying. Well, I don't know if what I saw was exactly flying. It was airborne. That's the UFO object. Was what I saw an object? I don't know. I mean, I saw what I saw. It was a phenomenal experience. It was a UAP rather than a UFO. And if you say UFO, you imagine like the flying saucer. What I saw was, much smaller than a flying saucer.
UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena.
Right. The term that was supposedly going to be outed through Hillary Clinton, but it went wrong. So it's not really in the public domain very, very much. But UAP is a much wider, more elastic name, and it doesn't have the baggage of UFO. And for my mind, it captures the idea of the smaller size of what I saw, which wasn't obviously carrying beings.
All right. I guess we can just leave it at that, but it does suggest that there are many dimensions to this process of mystical opening that we have yet to touch upon. Indeed.
And the experience of UFO or alien, that is also an initiation, of course.
Yeah. Well, Andy Hilton, it's been a great pleasure having this conversation, this initiatory, or shall I say initial, conversation with you. I look forward to more.
Me too. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being with me. And thank you for being with us. New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at CIHS.edu. You can now download all 9 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Book 4 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
For early access to our videos and live stream events, sign up for our free weekly newsletter at newthinkingaloud.org.